This video is sponsored by Squarespace, an all-in-one platform to build your own website, shop, or portfolio and create a compelling online presence. Hello, Hilde Hamskifter. My name is TP and League of Legends, with the benefit and bane of over a decade of development, has a lot of rather old champions on its roster. Many of those champions have been updated and maintained through the years, receiving visual and lore updates that have kept them current, or at least stopped them from becoming embarrassments. But there's also some champions who haven't been so lucky. One of my longtime complaints with Riot is that they have a history of prioritizing adding new characters to the game over maintaining the roster that they already have. It's a decision that makes perfect sense on the business side, I'm sure that makes the line go up somewhere. I'm sure it's the right move for maximizing hashtag engagement, TM metrics, or whatever. But as an artistic decision, as a decision for the quality and maintenance of the game, it's just wrong? I don't really know how to say it with more nuance than that. It's just wrong. There are characters in League of Legends that would feel cheap in a mid-budget PS2 game. There are champions for whom the totality of their lore and their story is, well, I guess they exist or whatever. And in a game with as many as 180 million monthly active users, a game that brings in around $1.5 billion in revenue every year, this is frankly an embarrassment. Now, creating visual updates, making new champions, doing development work for League of Legends is, to be fair, not only a matter of money. Running publishing across a global IP, training developers, developing pipelines, managing churn, recruitment, and all the other stuff that goes into game development, there are a lot of moving pieces beyond just the obvious. Riot couldn't, even if they wanted to, simply wave the money wand today and have 10 visual updates out by July. However, League of Legends has been an incredibly successful product for well over a decade now, and even if they couldn't just wave the money wand now, on a timescale of 10 years, I don't think it's unfair to criticize Riot for the prioritizations they have clearly made. If maintenance and updates of the existing roster had been a major priority over the course of the game's lifespan, then by now, they would have gotten it done. And the embarrassment is the fact that they have chosen not to prioritize this kind of maintenance. Riot has prioritized cramming a constant cavalcade of ever flashier, ever newer champions into the game with ever more complicated passives, and created a bigger and bigger backlog of lost narrative threads, dropped storylines, and outdated champions. And while I love a lot of the characters that they've come up with in that time, the price of it has been a severe and systematic neglect of their older characters. It's a big problem for the game, and it's a problem that Riot at times has seemed almost resentful to have to address. They've put out blog posts in the past with big, complicated data reasoning, showing that players just don't get excited for updates. It's not a big driver of engagement, and so we think we should spend our money on other stuff that's more exciting. And my response to that is yeah, no shit, people don't get excited for it. It's maintenance. Maintenance is boring. Maintenance is unglamorous, but the responsible thing is to do it anyway. Because, not for nothing, but if you're gonna ask your players to invest their time and their attention in these characters, then the literal least you can do is invest the maintenance necessary to keep their quality consistent. Refusing to do that because the ROI isn't great is, frankly, embarrassingly petty. This is a problem that goes well beyond Riot's champion updates, by the way. Their maintenance of projects like the Universe lore site, the interactive map, the central hub at Riot Nexus, the League Displays wallpaper app, it is a pattern with this company. Riot sits on a monstrous graveyard of projects that they have launched with fanfare and celebration and abandoned the moment the shine wore off. In the light of recent developments, I fear that even Legends of Runeterra may be going that way, and if the next couple of Riot Forge games don't do numbers either, I'm not optimistic for the future of that project. But when they do maintenance, when they can be convinced to spend the resources for a proper update, their artists, animators, writers, editors, and programmers can do a hell of a good job at it. Udyr, the Spirit Walker, was one of the very earliest champions added to the game, a peculiar mishmash of a wandering Asian monk and a Viking berserker shaman with a polygon count somewhere on the generous side of a Warcraft 3 unit. He has jogged around the Rift for nigh on 13 years now, flash bear slapping his way through the jungle, and in and out of the meta without Riot ever really paying much attention to his story and development. At least until a few years ago, when a major push to develop the Freljord started throwing crumbs of development off to him as well, and culminating this year when he finally got a desperately needed update. Let's see how that worked out. Udyr's update is a continuity project. His visual update is not remaking the character from scratch, but essentially bringing him forwards in time. His old form and story is not so much made non-canon as it is given an overhaul and a spit shine to bring it up to scratch. It's a fairly conservative rework in that way, as Riot's reworks have been more recently, but unlike with the disastrously unfocused Mundo, in Udyr, Riot had a decidedly more concrete story to work from. So, once upon the olden times, when League of Legends was young and I still had hope in my heart, Udyr was a character all about his anger. He was a boy born as a powerful spirit walker, which is a kind of shaman. They feel the spirits of animals and nature around them and can commune with them and even take on their form and power. But the more powerful a spirit walker is, the more sensitive they are to the whims of nature, the more vulnerable they also become to being overwhelmed by it. Udyr is a very powerful spirit walker, and thus a very vulnerable one. In his old lore, he was essentially a turbocharged, feral, raging wilderness man, dominated by the rage and wildness of nature, and his narrative, thin as it was, read largely as a simplistic Hulk-like story about anger management through martial arts therapy. He travels to the Pan-Asian monasteries of Ionia, where he learns unspecified spiritual and martial arts that help him get himself under control, and then he joins the League of Legends fighting tournament. As his lore was developed, though, especially after the introduction of his ultimate skin Spirit Guard, more depth was added to this narrative. Originally, Udyr was guided to train in Ionia by some unnamed monk who managed to calm his anger, but in later revisions, that monk became Sin, who would be a consistent feature in his story. Originally, Udyr was merely overwhelmed by the spirits of his homeland because they're really fierce, but in later revisions of the story, his lack of control seems to stem from deeply traumatic experiences. Lysandra is eventually introduced as an antagonist to his story. She orders the slaughter of his tribe, and it is the rage and horror of seeing this happen that triggers Udyr's most uncontrollable outbursts. In the original story, Udyr's training at the Hirana monastery with Sin is simply an exercise in learning to control himself a bit better, but in later revisions, his stay in Hirana becomes a spiritually reshaping experience, from which he only returns to the Freljord because he feels the spirits of that land crying out in terror of the void. And that then was the status quo for his lore for a very long time. He was a rageful spirit walker from the Freljord who traveled to Ionia, learned to control himself a bit better, and then returned to the Freljord because something spiritual unease, probably fight Lysandra and the Void or whatever. A very late addition to his story, teased only in 2019, is his relationship to Sejuani. Udyr, it turns out, was a lover of Sejuani's mother Kalkia, and thus he takes on the role of a father to Sejuani. Now, we don't know if he's her biological father, but it also kind of doesn't matter because in the Freljord, fatherhood is not necessarily a biological relationship, but a social one. Ashe had multiple fathers, all of whom were sworn to her mother, and Udyr is thus oath father of Sejuani, regardless of what their genetic relationship might be. With the update, his story really hasn't changed all that much. One thing that's new is that Udyr is now not merely a gifted or a powerful spirit walker, but the single most powerful spirit walker ever to spirit walk the earth, whose birth was heralded by a blood-red moon. He is the hope of the universe, the answer to all living things that cry out for peace, the protector of the innocent, the legendary Super Shaman. He did not merely unleash his powers in anger and trauma when the Frostguard slaughtered his tribe. He called upon so much spiritual magic that it brought down an entire mountain on them. And the experience of being so overwhelmed by his own power further scarred him and made him terrified of himself. After the loss of his tribe, he wandered the wilderness for many years alone, eventually joining up with the Winter's Claw, who recognized his powers. And there, he met Kalkia, Sejuani's mother, who became his lover and tried to teach him how to be among people again. Udyr leaves the Winter's Claw when his uncontrollable powers almost makes him kill a child, and his fear of himself is what sends him back into seclusion. It is then that he meets Sin. In older versions of the story, Sin sort of easily deflects and dodges everything Udyr throws at him because Sin is a cool martial artist monk. But now, because Udyr is the Super Shaman, they have to have like an epic battle to a mutual standstill. Anyway, Sin convinces Udyr to join him on the journey back to Ionia, during which the two of them, let me see what it says here, grow close, taking time each day to spar together and to speak of the spirits.
Lee, my spirit, our mastery will be our victory.
In Ionia, Udyr helps Lee Sin defend the Hirana monastery from the Noxian invasion, and then he trains with the monks, learning to master the spirits of Ionia and calm himself and to resist the violent urges of savagery he feels in the Freljord. This period of his life is represented canonically by the spirit guard Udyr Ultimate Skin. Eventually, he decides to travel back home to the Freljord, although in this version now, he's not drawn by any spiritual call from his homeland, but returns because he understands that to truly master himself, he needs to do it among the spirits that he struggles the most with, the spirits of his homeland. Lee Sin gives him one of his blindfolds to remember him by.
I have missed you, Lee. Let our spirits melt. Let us spar.
And Udyr returns to the Winter's Claw. The Winter's Claw is now led by Sejuani, and Udyr works his way up to becoming her trusted spiritual advisor and surrogate father. And this is where we begin to see another new addition to Udyr as a character, his politics. Udyr believes that the Freljord is a region inherently defined by struggle, that all living things within it find their balance only in a kind of constant state of survivalism, a constant battle for existence. Thus, the goal of the Avarosans, to unite all the Freljord under the banner of peace, is to Udyr essentially a kind of blasphemy. He believes it will kill the spirits of the Freljord, that it goes against the inborn nature of his homeland and against the inborn nature of all true Freljordians. In this, he actually aligns with Volibear, who's similarly obsessed with struggle and wildness as the only valid mode of being. In Volibear's view, anyone who doesn't struggle to survive is weak and deserves death at the hands of those with a greater will to power and survival. Udyr doesn't go quite so far as that. Unlike Volibear, he doesn't revel in violence and death. He sees it more as conditions against which living things must struggle to self-actualize. But like Volibear, Udyr expresses a kind of political conservative primitivism. He believes in preserving the Freljord as it is, and he believes that living in close connection with a kind of state of nature is the proper way to be Freljordian. He believes that enacting radical social or societal change is a form of destabilizing evil. Never mind that the state of nature in the Freljord is one where tribes raid and kill each other for food in the winter, where entire communities starve and freeze to death on the regular, and where the infirm, the disabled, and just those who are baseline peaceful in their lifestyles are made victims by those who are powerful, who are cruel, and who are warlike. Never mind that a better world might be possible. Udyr is a traditionalist, and things should stay the way they are because that's how they've always been. And I bring this up, by the way, not as a criticism of Udyr as a character. I think it's really good that League of Legends has characters whose politics I strongly personally disagree with. I bring it up to point out that Udyr's politics, like Volibear's, aren't just fanciful fantasy fiction, but real politics held by real people in the real world. That is a strength in his character writing. You can hear echoes of Udyr's political ideas in anarcho-primitivism to some extent, in libertarianism, and most definitely in conservatism. Whether Riot will ever actually meaningfully explore this political dimension to his character is doubtful. Riot is a liberal corporation, and they prefer to reduce their political themes to conflicts and disagreements between individuals, rather than conflicts between ideologies or conflicts within structures or systems. Besides his politics, Udyr now also has the first canonical encounter ever in the lore that I know about with the Seal Sister, a sibling god to Anivia, Ornn, and Volibear, who gives him a blessing towards some as yet unknown purpose. With its power, he begins to feel a strange spiritual shift in the Freljord, a kind of awful death wail, as though the land itself is slowly being torn apart. Udyr blames the Avarosans for this, believing they are upsetting the balance, but it's heavily implied that what he's actually feeling is the resurgent consciousness of the void under the howling abyss, threatening to break out and consume the world once again. This mistake from him, like his encounter with the Seal Sister, all feels like the setup for some future storyline, but whether these storylines are meant to be developed in lore for League of Legends, or as a Riot Forge game, or whether they're being saved for the eventual MMO, well, that's anyone's guess. Anyway, Udyr and Lee Sin are boyfriends, and I can prove it to you. Before I do though, this video is sponsored by Squarespace, an all-in-one service for creating a dynamic and compelling presence online. Squarespace has a ton of features that can help you create either a cool and professional-looking portfolio or even a central hub for your whole online business. You can use Squarespace to create a custom commissions storefront, complete with all the tracking and administrative tools you need to track orders and fulfillment, or you can use it to host a webcomic. That's what I did with Squarespace back in the day, and while the comics that I made back then haven't aged super great, cringe to look at them now, the site that they're displayed on still looks remarkably nice, especially considering it was put together by me, a man with the technical coding skill of a wet potato. If I can build a site with Squarespace, then believe me, anybody can. So head to squarespace.com to start a free trial, and when you're ready to launch the site, go to squarespace.com/tbskyen to save 10% on your first purchase of a website or domain. In League of Legends, counting only the champions and nobody else, here is a mostly complete list of the platonic friendships and relationships between the characters. Jarvan and Garen, Jarvan and Xin Zhao, Irelia and Riven, Vayne and Graves, Gwen and everyone in the Sentinels of Light, Akshan and Lucian, Ashe and Sejuani, Azir and Xerath, Braum and Ashe, Ziggs and Heimerdinger, Corki, Tristana and Lulu, Draven and Swain, Fizz and Nautilus, Fiora and Garen, Galio and Lux, Jace and Victor, Shen and Zed, Kennen and Shen, Master Yi and Wukong, Nico and Nidalee, Nunu and Willem, Quinn and Garen, Rumble and Tristana, Kennen and Akali, Sivir and Talia, Talia and Nasus, Taric and Garen, Teemo and Tristana, Yasuo and Talia, Zoe and Aurelion Sol, and Ciri and Echo. On top of that, of course, there's also Yasuo, Braum, Alawi, Misfortune, Ahri, and arguably Pyke, who all made friends with each other, and in turn, they all made friends with Maokai in the Ruined King game. If we expand the list to champions who are platonic friends with characters who are not champions, or just all the characters in the lore, I could read you this list for hours. So, if you were thinking of posting in my comment section some variation of, why can't characters just be friends anymore, kindly shut your trap and keep it shut. This asinine idea that queerness or queer relationships are being forced unnaturally into either League of Legends or indeed any form of media at the cost of the sanctity of platonic friendship is, at best, irrational nonsense, and at worst, it is the impotent whining of bigots who get mad when someone dares to bring up queerness where they can see it. So anyway, Udyr and Lee Sin are boyfriends? Question mark? Like, obviously, I've been joking about it and I've been playing voice lines, but if we are being serious and we put the jokes away, is there any actual real evidence that their relationship is romantic? Well, that depends on what you are willing to accept as evidence. Udyr calls Lee Sin his most beloved and worthy opponent. He calls him my spirit. He says that Lee Sin helped him claim himself in explicit comparison to how Kalkia, who was also his lover, helped him to find himself. He wears one of Lee Sin's blindfolds on his hand as an eternal reminder of their bond, and he says that when they spar, their spirits meld. So, is all of this evidence of a romantic connection, or is it just hearty, unembarrassed masculine friendship? Some people might say it's one, some people might say it's the other, but I say that it's both. It is both of those things. Something which does frustrate me in the way that we talk about romance, and I'm speaking as an aromantic person here, admittedly, is the idea that romance and friendship are somehow opposites, that the existence of one must cancel out the other. If Udyr and Lee Sin are lovers, then god damn it, their friendship is destroyed, it's ruined, it's not pure anymore. And if they're friends, well, a love relationship is simply impossible. A lover can never be your friend, no, they must be an opponent in the great game of love. But romance and friendship aren't opposites, they are complementary. They exist together and they reinforce each other. However you want to look at it, Udyr definitely expresses more than just casual friendship with Lee Sin. These two men are close. They are spiritual companions with a close physical relationship and a deep mutual affection. And I think insisting that this must be either romance or platonic friendship is a really reductive view of how relationships work. Seeing it as either thing is definitely valid, but insisting that it can only be one or the other, no, I think frankly that's kind of myopic. I like that the affection between Udyr and Lee Sin is obvious and sincere and impossible to ignore, but not necessarily labeled. That it very obviously could be, or at any moment become, romantic, but that the characters themselves don't really seem to fret over that. I like that they don't seem terribly concerned about whether their friendship is platonic or romantic. But, unfortunately, there is a rather nasty catch to all of this. While I think it's nice that Udyr and Lee Sin have a somewhat ambiguous relationship, that ambiguity comes with baggage. Riot Games has a bit of a history and a long and cheerful tendency to engage in queerbaiting and pinkwashing. They like to market themselves on Pride, they like to espouse progressive corporate values and a deep belief in the rights and dignity of LGBTQ people everywhere on Earth. But they also like to do business in countries with deeply homophobic governments. They also like to sign expensive sponsorship deals with nation-states that execute people for being gay. So when Riot Games, the corporation, creates a character relationship that could be queer, that could be gay, homosexual, gay, but which is kept deliberately just vague enough that they have plausible deniability when they need it, yeah, no, I don't think I trust that they created the ambiguity in the relationship in order to tell some kind of story about the nebulousness of close emotional relationships and make a point about how platonic and romantic love don't necessarily need to be opposites. I think they did it to avoid pissing off the homophobes that run the countries where they make most of their money, like Russia and China and the United States. We live in heteronormative societies. Straightness is treated as the unquestionable default, the standard from which everything else is considered some kind of a deviation. Under those conditions, ambiguity allows people to pretend that queerness doesn't exist if they don't want to see it, but everyone who would like to see it all of a sudden has to fight and argue and present evidence in order to have their perspective recognized. Everyone who wants to see it is presumed wrong until they prove queerness. Which is why I like to bring it up so much. It's why I keep harping on TF and Graves being obvious husbands. It's why I keep reminding people that Talia is trans and Rel is bisexual and that there is no way in hell that Lux isn't some form of gay. I choose to be specific because ambiguity fosters denial. So yeah, I like that Udyr and Lee Sin's relationship isn't labeled. I think it's okay to think of them as very close and affectionate friends. But if you ever ask me, I'm gonna say that they're boyfriends. Now, as a quick note, none of what I've said here is a slam on the artists or writers who made the Udyr update. They're workers doing the best they can with the circumstances that they have. My criticism points upwards. I point at the executives, the owners, the shareholders, and the economic system that incentivizes them. Corporate pride is always tainted. Corporate pride is always a compromise, and being the game's workers will do nothing to change that. When League of Legends was first published in 2009, I think it's fair to say that there was no Ionia in the game. Oh, the region existed, technically, in name, but short of a half-sketched piece of concept art, it didn't actually exist in any meaningful way, except as a label to slap on a map and as a justification to put characters inspired by Asian myths and culture into the game. Udyr's original design, thus, is a cartoonish hodgepodge. His design doesn't have any Ionian or Freljordian culture to reference because it doesn't exist yet, and he doesn't have the polygon count to even attempt subtlety. He wears the bearskin cap of a stereotypical shaman or Norse berserker, he has the body of a bodybuilder, runs around on Japanese gaita clogs with a band of prayer beads around his arm, and wears a gi and hakama, I think, outfit with torn and ragged sleeves because he is a wild man. Ask someone with no idea about League of Legends lore to describe to you what kind of character Udyr looks like, and they'd probably be kinda stumped, like beyond the universality of big guy who wears bearskin as a signifier for barbarian of some kind. To examine how Udyr's rework changed him, though, we actually have to examine 3 character designs, because Riot spread his change all over the timeline. The first new Udyr design is his ultimate skin, Spirit Guard. This design represents Udyr as he was by the end of his training in Ionia, remarkably at peace with himself, practicing martial arts forms learned at the Hirana Monastery, and fully committed to Ionian fashion. This design preserves his gaita clogs and emphasizes what we know now as Ionian aesthetics, those flowing lines on the skirt, the intricate tree-inspired design on the gauntlets, the extremely conspicuous belt of prayer orbs. Even his hairstyle, with that spiky mane of long hair and well-kept beard, echoes the general sleek elegance that Riot likes to use for Ionia. His spell effects even take on a bit more of an anime-esque vibe, pulling iconography directly from Dragon Ball Super Saiyans for his awakened forms. The second new Udyr design comes from Legends of Runeterra, representing Udyr newly returned to the Freljord after his stay in Ionia. Here, he adopts a simple traveling outfit and probably the closest echo of his original design. He has the bearskin cap, he has the bear print on the front of his outfit, and the colors more or less match the way that he looked in his original form. He has clearly recently shaved his head and cut his ponytail, and the giant prayer bead from Spirit Guard has shrunk to a much more manageable bandolier. He also retains the combat gloves from Ionia, but they are now adorned with bone bone amulets, presumably representing the Freljord's spiritual traditions. His beard has also started to grow wilder, and his hair has begun to exhibit the matting that will come to define it later. Where Spirit Guard represents Udyr fully immersed in the culture of Ionia, and the new base design represents him fully returned to the Freljord, this is the in-between state. This is mixing and matching aspects of both designs. Consequently, it's also the least strong of the new designs, I think, struggling to look striking or iconic in its own right. It's the old design with all the cartoony exaggeration taken out of it. He looks less like the greatest spirit walker ever to spirit walk the earth, and more like just a regular shaman, like he's called Greg or something. This now just leaves us with the third and final new Udyr design, which is Base Udyr. Udyr here has fully returned to the wilderness of the Freljord, which is represented in his design in a couple of ways. First, though, the main thing about this Udyr is simplification. Old Udyr was never a complicated design as such, but new Udyr strips him down even further to the very barest essentials. He's a shirtless man in leather pants with matted hair and some cool tattoos. This simplicity has a point. Udyr's big visual party trick is his stances and their spell effects, so the base design is kept simple, I think, at least in part, so as not to overshadow them. It keeps the visual communication of where Udyr gets his power from clear and readable. Outside of gameplay communication, though, well, look, the oldest visual trope of the wild barbarian is nakedness. If you want to show that someone is wild and rough around the edges and uncivilized, air quotes, making them some level of undressed is an extremely basic way to do that. This is a trope that has all kinds of complicated and problematic history. During colonialism, colonizers and slavers loved to use fashion as evidence that their victims were uncultured and uncivilized. The wild man was almost always depicted in various states of nakedness because he had no culture, no industry, no refinement, in contrast to the finely dressed Europeans who had come to civilize him. And this goes all the way back to the interactions between Rome and the Germanic tribes, and is particularly relevant to my people, the Vikings. The wild, shirtless Viking was, and is, just look at that goddamn Vikings TV show, a visual trope that's employed over and over again to show that my ancestors were some level of barbaric and uncultured, wild and sexually untamed, uncivilized and unchristian. It's an old propaganda trope which survives in a more crowd-pleasing form in our modern pop culture, and for my money, in the context of Vikings at least, it is mostly harmless. Like, I'm not upset that they're using it, I'm just trying to put it into a proper historical context. This is where that trope of the half-naked wild barbarian Northman emerged from, and Riot sure are fond of using it, especially in the Freljord. Which, by the way, Riot, neither Udyr nor Tryndamere are even Iceborn, so when you make Udyr's joke animation a sort of shivering like, oh haha, he's cold because he's not wearing a proper shirt thing, and you give characters voice lines that like lampshade the fact that so many Freljord champions are not dressed as though they live in the Freljord, if you have to make this many jokes about how dumb the design trope you're using is in order to justify it, maybe that's a sign that there's a better design solution out there somewhere that you can use for your characters, eh? On the topic of shirtlessness, though, hang on, Spirit Guard Udyr is also shirtless, but clearly he's not supposed to be an uncivilized wild man, and that's true. In the same way that the color red can mean either sex, blood, or danger, depending on context, shirtlessness as a semiotic tool in character design depends on context. Spirit Guard Udyr is dressed in an elaborate lower robe with gorgeous fabrics mixing gold and pure white, and his chest is adorned in a belt of beautifully crafted prayer beads. His design draws on tropes and archetypes related to a sort of pop-cultural pan-Asian imagining about martial artists and ascetic monks. He's dressed to go standing under a waterfall to meditate for 11 hours. He's dressed to fight a sudden ambush of ninjas. The clothes he does wear have the affect of expense and fine tailoring. Even shirtless, he looks expensive. Compare that with Base Udyr, whose rough and simple fashion with his matted hair, wild beard, and rough appearance draws on the Western pop cultural trope of the barbaric northern wild man. And it is within that context that his shirtlessness takes on that particular pop cultural meaning. So, Legends of Runeterra Udyr retains a shirt and proper clothes, as well as well-managed hair and vestiges of his Ionian fashion to show that he has not yet descended fully into Freljordian wildness, and Base Udyr rocks the shirtless dad bod and the matted hair to show that he has descended into wildness. Except, wait a minute, dad bod? This is a dad bod? Well, Riot certainly seems to think so, explicitly calling him that in a development post, and this is where I have to get back up on my soapbox again for a second, because a dad bod specifically is the body of someone who's past their physical prime. Like, that's the whole point. It's the body of a dad, someone who's settled down, who's had children, who spends more time napping and less time at the gym, someone who eats more steaks and drinks more beer, and whose body is no longer young enough to just metabolize all of the junk out. Udyr does not have a dad bod. He has the flinty, carved physique of a goddamn champion powerlifter. No, like, he isn't gym bro bodybuilder shredded with a 12-pack and rippling pectorals or whatever. He's in Braum, but he still looks like he spends his time lifting boulders and fist-fighting bears. The mere presence of a tummy does not a dad bod make, any more than the fact that Evelyn has a slight curve on her hips makes her thick. Seriously though, stop calling characters like this thick. You are driving me insane. That is not what thick means. Anyway, the point is, Udyr doesn't have a dad bod. He's f***ing jacked. That's not what a dad bod looks like. Besides the simplicity of the Mountain Wildman design, Udyr's rework also comes with some subtle and actually very clever storytelling. He wears a belt of Ionian-style beads with a braided rope reminiscent of like those Ionian ropes over what looks like Freljordian padding and fabrics around his waist. And of course, around his left hand, he keeps Lee Sin's blindfold wrapped like a memento. Along with the feather in his hair and his necklace and the horn on his waist and the amulet around his arm, it all contributes to the sense of a fairly simple man, but a man who has a story. Like, this dude looks like he's been some places and seen some things, he's just not very obvious about it. And that is appropriate for him, because Udyr isn't really a main character by nature. The way that he's written, he's dedicated to serving the spirits of the Freljord and protecting and guiding his daughter. A big part of how he sees himself, and at least this is my interpretation, a big part of how he copes with his trauma and survivor's guilt is by devoting his life to other people, and how he copes with his fear of his powers is by devoting himself to the spirits of his homeland. Like, my sense is that that's the source of a lot of his conservative politics. And that consonance, that his character's base design is simple and unassuming, and that all the flash and superpower is something that he essentially is putting on like a costume, it ties in really well with that retiring personality, with that sense that he shuns the limelight. Udyr's rework isn't the flashiest design in the game, but I think, overall, it is genuinely amazingly well executed. So, this is where we take a look at Udyr's animation, and it's going to be a little bit different this time. Normally, I hop into a model viewer and live analyze the animation frame by frame, but I kind of can't do that with Udyr because his model just isn't available in those viewers yet. I'm not sure why. So instead, I've asked for help from my buddy Chibin, who's a community animator. He has made a ton of cool animation projects. His channel is linked in the description, and you should all go check him out. His work deserves a lot more attention than it gets. He was able to extract Udyr's animation from the game with stance effects and everything so that we can have a look at it. Udyr has an unusually large number of animation cycles because he has variations on a lot of them corresponding to each of his stances. Something we talk about a lot in these videos is how animation, even incidental or idle animation, is a means to express something about a character, who they are, how they exist in the world, how they relate physically to their environment. With Udyr, though, there's a wrinkle on that, because when he channels a spirit for his stances, he embodies them. In a sense, he becomes them, and his whole body language is adjusted accordingly. So Udyr's animation is designed to communicate both something about him, but also something about the spirit characters that he's physically mimicking, which must have been a damn interesting challenge for the animators. Now, as we examine his animation, as always, remember to keep in mind that League of Legends animation is designed to be looked at from up here, not down here, and a lot of things that might look awkward or a bit exaggerated up close do look a lot better in-game. So, let's start with the bear stance. This stance is defined by barely contained raging tension and aggression. Here, in the idle animation, you can see how the shoulders are up and the head is down and he's leaning forward in a sort of classical, aggressive and kind of predatory stance. And you can see how the giant claws are flexing as though anticipating bloodshed. They're trembling with that barely contained energy, that desire to do something. The run animations maintain this energy. He moves a bit like an animal chasing prey, claws out to the side and always at the ready to swipe. which is what he does in the attack animation. He throws these big, wide, powerful haymaker swings, emphasizing the raking motion of the claw. He turns his entire upper body into the swing and lands in this rather vulnerable position, actually. And the one thing I want you to notice the most is the very wide, open stances that sort of define the physical attitude of the bear. The ram and the boar both carry themselves very differently, as we shall see in a moment, and those posture differences tell you something both about the attitude of the spirit that he's channeling, but also, of course, something about his capabilities in terms of the gameplay when he's taking those stances. They give you sort of an impression of what kind of thing Udyr is capable of doing while this stance is active. The ram is the next stance we'll look at, and there is aggression in this idle animation too, or at least a sense of confrontation. But unlike the bear, like quivering with anticipation of violence, with the ram, it's more of a standoff. Note those clenched fists and the shoulders kept forward. He's angling the big blunt horns of the form forwards. It's less a "I'm gonna kill you" posture, and more like a "come at me bro, I'm gonna go right through you" kind of posture. He's even more hunched over and leaned forward than the bear. He's got one foot way forward of his body, giving sort of the impression of a runner getting ready to go off, almost. It has an impatient energy, almost like he should be scraping a hoof in the dirt and snorting as he's getting ready for a charge. His run animation is where that impatience then gets unleashed. Where the bear stance run is a sort of loping and intense, like smooth forwards run, the ram is a charge. He's taking huge, heavy steps. He's swinging his entire upper torso side to side, swinging those big arms and elbows as though he's trying to just shove away anything that dares to get in his way. The attack animations, to a certain extent, have that same wide swing that the bear uses, but where the bear is a big wide swipe with the claws, like reaching all the way out to reach his opponent, the ram comes across almost as more of a shoulder check. The position of the hand is low, and the elbow and the shoulder are high up, and the movement really emphasizes the role of the spirit horns in delivering the blow to the enemy, rather than his actual fists. The ram also has its special empowered attack, which here takes the form of a huge overhead slam, essentially mimicking the kind of getting up on your hind knees and bringing your head down thing that goats tend to do. Udyr leaps into the air. He has just a moment of coyote time, sort of almost hovering in the air, just a moment to build up a bit of tension, and then he brings his entire upper body down to slam the ground. Again, the swing that he's doing with his arms is big, but they never fully extend forward. They stay bent and fairly close to his body because, again, he's emphasizing the use of the horns as the real means of delivering the impact of his attack. Moving on to the Phoenix, this stance has the most extreme of his idle poses. His arms are fanned out in a wide imitation of wings, and he has this very hunched over stance that seems to be trying to imitate the body plan of an actual bird. His hands are open, like the bear stance, but there's none of that trembling tension of barely suppressed rage. His arms are tense, but they are steady. They follow the breathing motion of the body smoothly up and down. The Phoenix run, interestingly, is somewhat different than what I might have thought. From the idle pose, I might have expected something like a Naruto run with the arms held backwards, but no. Instead, we actually get a fairly normal-looking walk cycle. It's mostly just maintaining the tension in the arms and keeping the ice-shard wings pointed backwards. He's markedly more upright here than he is in either the ram or the bear stances, and the effect is one of a decidedly calmer mood to the character animation. Like the tensed claw pose of his hands keeps a certain level of tension present in his movement, and his strides are purposeful, so it's not like it's a casual saunter, but the vibe is definitely very different. It feels more calm, more controlled than either of the other two previous ones. The attack animations, though, are where the Phoenix gets really fun to look at, because they take the form of essentially judo chops. He makes these curving, slicing, and slashing motions, emphasizing the ice-shard wings as the ones that deliver the actual attack, and the motions feel much more precise and measured than either the ram or bear. It's less a rampaging haymaker that he's throwing, and more of a precise, calculated swipe with a blade. Which leads us finally to the boar stance, and this stance has the extra distinction that it is also Udyr's unstanced animation. That is, when he doesn't have an actual stance active yet, these are the moves that he defaults to. I don't know if that's supposed to imply that he has some kind of special affinity with the boar spirit, or whether it was just convenient, but I kind of hope it's the former, because the boar would kind of fit with Udyr's whole personality, I think. He does look a little bit funny, with his head all the way down below his shoulders and that tuft of spiritual fur giving him a decidedly hunchbacked look, but again, it's meant to be seen from up above, which kind of lessens the hunchback vibe, and all it really is an exaggerated boxing stance. He's got the shoulders up, the head low, and the arms at the ready to guard against incoming attacks. His run animation especially makes this clear because he's not running here. Instead, he's walking steadily forwards, keeping his head steady, keeping the guard up, and he looks like a boxer carefully closing distance with an opponent. Even when he's hasted, even though he does break into a proper run here, those arms are up, always up, protecting the head, keeping the guard strong. And so too it goes with his basic attack. The guard stays up all the time, every time he punches, and it is overall a much more conservative punch than the rest of the forms. There's no huge swinging arm movements, there's no haymakers, there's no swipes or slashes, and that makes sense because in-game, the boar is by far the least offensive of the forms. It's the one that does the least damage. For all that the boar is a conservative stance, though, and for all that its animation doesn't seem big or excessive, I wonder what would happen if we turned off the spell effects and slowed it down and took a closer look and... Yeah, there it is. That's the smearing. That's what we like to see. And this is a really well-hidden smear, too, because looking at the animation in full speed, it's basically impossible to see it, which of course is kind of the point. But with characters like Mordekaiser, for example, even when you see the animation in full speed, you can kind of tell that there's a lot of breaking going on. Udyr, on the other hand, has hidden it really well. So, the way this works is that as he's rearing up to punch, the animator adds elastic tension to the animation by letting his torso move forwards while the fist sort of stays behind, essentially. And then, after a moment, the fist then follows the motion, takes a brief little pause, and then the body and fist fully snap forwards, delivering a really satisfying straight punch. In slow motion, it looks completely ridiculous, but in full speed, it looks perfect, and that stretching, that breaking of the model adds a really good pop to his movement. And like with many champions, these smears are all over Udyr's animation. You can see them in a couple of the other stances here that I've slowed down as well. But I just thought that his regular unstanced punch is probably one of the clearest and best demonstrations of how these smears work. If you watched my What's the Deal with Belveth video, there I complained a little bit that Belveth kind of doesn't have this a lot in her animation, and I really think she could have used it. Those breakages and those snappings and those smears, they aren't really super visible in the animation when you're just sort of looking at it, but they add that sense of tension and release. They add that sense of elasticity, and it prevents the character from becoming too stiff. Of all of Udyr's animations, though, my favorites have got to be his dance and his laugh. Like I said, most of his stances are all about conveying the vibe or the feel of the spirit that he's channeling, and so it is the social animations that give us our best look at Udyr as a personality. His dance, especially compared to the relative dourness of his combat animation, is just this burst of lively, fun energy. He drops into a wide stance, he pounds his own chest, and then he sets off on this circular hop dance with his hands flapping as he goes. It has a very sort of your dad in a good mood after 3 beers vibe, and you really do get the sense that the man is having fun with it. Udyr is a big chunky guy, and there's a great sense of gravity to his hopping here, a great sense of physicality. He never looks weightless or effortless, which is sometimes the risk you take when you give a character a dance animation. Udyr's physical presence, I think, is an important part of the character, and so it's nice to see it preserved here. And speaking of his physical presence, his laugh is a straight-up Looney Tunes affair, almost. It leads in with this little popcorn jump, and then becomes this huge chest-forward, knees-bouncing, enormous, joyful belly laugh. It's almost less a laugh than it's a roar of mirth, with Udyr even having to catch himself and lower into an even wider stance, almost as though he's nearly buckling over with humor. And the best part, to finish out the animation, the best touch of all, the animators made him do a big fatherly slap of the knee. This animation just makes me happy to look at. It looks like it must have been such a lot of fun to create, and Udyr himself also just looks so joyful in it. Like, this isn't a confident ha-ha, and it isn't like a sort of, oh, I'm superior. This is a big, loud, happy belly laugh with absolutely no sense of embarrassment. It's really good. All in all, Udyr's animation does a really great job of communicating the nature of the spirits that he's channeling. You get a sense of the bear's aggression, the ram's stubbornness, the boar's defensiveness, and so on, but the frivolous animations are the ones that do by far the most to endear me to Udyr as a character. Like, all his other animation is all business and no pleasure, but a man who laughs and dances like that, I want to party with that guy. I mean, come on. Now we arrive at the segment where we step outside the bounds of canon. We look at the lines that are being drawn in the character's narrative and we try to follow them to a probable, or at least a plausible, conclusion. In other words, it's the segment where I write fanfiction prompts for ad money. And Udyr, well, like I said previously, he's very much set up to be a supporting character by nature, which doesn't mean he doesn't have his own story arc, of course, just that when we consider the plot around him, I don't think he reads as the primary driver of the plot. And the plot in question is the plot of the Freljord, the region in which his spiritual practice and narrative takes place. The big story of the Freljord is the War of the Three Sisters, which played out the first time in the deep and mythic past when Lysandra betrayed her siblings and made a fateful bargain with the Void, and which is now playing out again in spirit. Ash and Sejuani stand in for Avarosa and Cyrilda, coming back to symbolically haunt Lysandra for her crimes and set right the wrong that she once committed. We've discussed how I think that this is all going to end in the What's the Deal with Lysandra video, link in the card up in the corner there, and I think this is pretty much also the trajectory of Udyr's story. He will participate in the final stand against the Void of the Howling Abyss, protecting Sejuani as he has sworn to do. So how does the overarching plot relate back to him as a character? Well, there are two major components to Udyr's character. The first is his connection to Sejuani and his oath as her father. This is all about his role as a protector and a father figure, but also seems to tease Sejuani as the means by which Udyr once again finds a way to belong to a people. She is how he finds his purpose. It's how he finds a place to belong, which ties into the second major component of the character, his anger and his trauma and his fear of himself. Udyr was barely more than a child when Lysandra's soldiers slaughtered his tribe in front of him, and he unleashed utterly uncontrollable, cataclysmic powers that night. He's terrified of those powers. He's terrified of what he could unleash, what he could become, and who he could hurt if he ever loses himself again. So he's driven on the one hand by a desperate desire to protect the ones he loves and to never have to lose them again, and on the other side by a deep-seated fear that he would be the one to hurt them, that he would be the one to drive them away. Lysandra probably slaughtered his tribe specifically to get to him, or at least to prevent a threat to her power like him from emerging. And while I don't know if Udyr knows this, I can imagine that he's haunted by more than a little survivor's guilt for, first of all, getting out alive, and also for crushing whoever else might have survived the raid under the mountain that he brought down upon the whole valley. This is why he self-exiled from Calkia and the Winter's Claw. It's why he traveled to Ionia in search of discipline and self-control. It's a really fundamental part of his character motivation. So, how do we move those parts of his character towards development or conclusion? Well, one way to do it is to give him a perfect triumph. He fears his Spirit Walker nature because his powers are overwhelmingly strong, and he fears losing the people that he loves. And at the Battle of the Howling Abyss, when the Void finally breaks through its prison of true ice and the Freljord's final apocalyptic battle is held, both of those fears are a pretty natural component of the narrative. Once again, he is at the risk of seeing everyone he loves wiped out around him, and once again, he must make himself vulnerable to the danger of his own powers to try to save them, exactly like he did on that fateful night so long ago. So, picture this. The united armies of the Freljord are on the bridge of the Howling Abyss, charging down the Frostguard and trolls and servants of Lysandra. And then the true ice finally fails. Things that should not be scream into existence, and as the Ice Witch herself turns to desperately battle back the rising Watchers, the depths under the howling abyss begin to swarm. The dams have burst, and the Voidborn army that was sealed 1,000 years ago surges like a vengeful geyser. On the bridge, Sejuani sees the Avarosan frontline fighting Lyssandra's Frostguard, who have now turned to rush back to their mistress's side. The Avarosans were meant to draw the Frostguard in, stretch them thin for the Winter's Claw to charge, but Ash's lines are now in disarray, and she is vulnerable. Udyr sees a moment of anger pass over his daughter's face, as though she's considering letting Ash die on her own for leading them into all of this. But it's only a moment. She looks at him and her jaw sets, and she looks so much like Calkia. The War Mother makes a decision. Her true ice flail cracks in the air, and like an arrow loosed from a bow, the Winter's Claw charges. Boars and Wild Claws, riders and raiders, iceborn and hearthbound, howling like the storm of war itself, they burst through the lines of the Avarosan tribesmen and chase the routing Frostguard and crash into the coming tide of monsters. Udyr calls the spirit of the lynx, but even with its quickened steps, he loses pace to bristle. He sees the back of his daughter riding ahead of him, tearing through the Voidborn before her, and his eyes strain to capture every moment of her. He's proud beyond what words can express, but even as his heart swells for her, he feels despair begin to rise in his throat. There are too many of them. He knows it, and she knows it too. And he knows that she would never, ever lead a retreat. He rips a Voidborn out of the air as it leaps at him and throws another off the ledge, screeching, but his eyes do not leave her. He cannot bear to see her die. He cannot bear to look away. And it costs him. From outside his peripheral vision, a Voidborn launches at him and tears into his arm. He screams and crushes it into the stones, and still, he cannot look away from her. Another beast comes flying, and he sees it too late. He tries to pivot, and then the air resonates like the thrum of a bell, and Lee Sin whirls into existence over his head and kicks it out of the air in a single graceful motion. Lee lands and touches Udyr on the shoulder. Be the center. Behind them, the other Hirana monks skirmish with the beasts, weaving protective mantras around struggling warriors. For a moment, Udyr catches the scent of the grove where they used to train together. There is no fear in you that isn't of you, Lee shouts, spinning around to kick another monster away. You have mastered this. Now practice it. He shoves Udyr roughly, parting them just as a monstrous claw comes down where they stood, and he whirls away again, disappearing into the thick of it. The other monks advance, surging past Udyr, and for just a moment the space around him clears. For just a moment there is stillness. He breathes, and the Freljord air surges into him, and he clenches his hand around his amulet, Calkia's amulet, and he looks around. He sees Sejuani, a raging, unbreakable bulwark, and he feels her heartbeat in his throat. He sees Braum shielding the fallen behind him, and hears his reassuring laughter. He sees Ash raising her bow with eyes like steel, and the chill of true ice rips up his arms as she lets a crystal arrow fly. He sees Olaf and Tryndamere whirling through the battlefield, and their resonating rage nearly punches out his chest. A moment before Nunu and Willem charge past, bowling over the Voidborn with a giant snowball, and he almost can't help but laugh. He sees the wary eyes of a deer on the mountainside far above. He feels the wind in a hawk's feathers. He hears the chittering of newborn sparrows. He cries the death cry of a rabbit caught by a wolf. He's the earthworm burrowing in the dirt. He is the mole that hunts it. He's the roots of the trees and the salmon in the stream. He's the newborn Elnuk calf taking its first steps. He's the old bull breathing its last. He is the stony heart of the mountains. He's the whirling eye of the storm. He's the heat of the forge and the first frost at dawn. He's the secrets in the deep waters. He's the seed that waits for spring. He is afraid, but he is alive. He is the Freljord, and he calls. From deep within the mountains, the call of a horn shakes the earth. In the sky, dark clouds begin to swirl. Snowflakes sharpen into blades in the air, and from out of the ground, rocks and iron start to stir. From far away in the seas, there is the laughing chitter of seals. Udyr breathes, and he takes a step, and 1,000 Voidborn fly screaming from the bridge of the Howling Abyss as a flaming ram charges through their mass. He takes a step, and the warriors of the Winter's Claw feel their skin harden like iron, and their spirits surge with stubborn pride. He takes a step, and a vortex of ice swirls around the Aberrosans, tearing monsters to shreds while barely frosting the people. He takes a step, and from out of the skies the Volibear roars into being and falls like thunder on the Watchers, sending them screaming back into the abyss. "Oh, I knew you had it in you!" the Seal Sister cheers, swirling through the air as though through water. "It's been 1,000 years since the last family reunion!" And she darts off, spilling healing waters over the fallen as she laughs. Udyr smiles, watching her go, and he turns and walks towards his astonished daughter. Wherever she is, there is his center. And from there, big battle for the Freljord plays out, blah blah blah, power, friendship, and unity. Maybe Lysandra redeems herself. Again, see what's the deal with Lysandra for that story. The idea of this scene is to give Udyr that moment of overcoming, of being able to both become the protector he couldn't be when his people died, and mastering the full extent of his super shaman power which has haunted him his entire life. And in order for a scene like this to really land, of course, it needs a lot more setup than what I'm actually able to give it here. We'd need more time spent with Udyr conquering his fears through his love for Sejuani. We'd need more time with him spent ruminating on what balance even means in the Freljord. We'd also need more time developing the whole Seal Sister's blessing mystery, because it's actually not really clear what that is all about. In this scene, I basically assumed that she gave him her blessing and power because she knew that he was the only person who could ever bring the gods of the Freljord back together, which, is obviously a big climactic moment that should be in the final battle for the Freljord, but maybe it's also kind of family therapy, like maybe she's using Udyr to force Ornn and Volibear and Anivia to start, talking to each other again. And I'm basing this on an assumption that she's a trickster god. That's kind of how she plays in Udyr's story anyway, so her using Udyr both to save the Freljord from the Void, but also mess with her family feels like an appropriately chaotic thing for her to want to do. But we don't actually know enough about the Seal Sister to know what it is that she wants Udyr to do, or even what her personality is like, really. But if you have another idea for how Udyr's story could play out, why not let me know in the comments? I'm curious what you all think. Udyr is, in my opinion, one of Riot's most unspectacularly successful reworks. By which I mean, he's incredibly well put together. Pretty much every aspect of the rework is a huge success, but it's not flashy about it. There's no huge gimmick, there's no show-stopping party trick, it's just a really well-crafted, unspectacular character who does exactly what he needs to do. His old character design was decidedly more cartoony, more over-the-top, and new Udyr has just taken everything, down a notch, but in a good way. He has strong elements of storytelling, but it's all in the details, it's all in the little things. The downside to that is a lot of his storytelling doesn't really come across in the game very well, which is always the trade-off with a MOBA. Rel's horse and Swain's demon hand, those are really readable details that tell you something about the character, but Lee Sin's blindfold wrapped around Udyr's hand, that's a detail so subtle that you'll likely never see it if you're not looking for it. But that subtlety is appropriate to the character. He's not really, as a person, someone concerned with being flashy or on show. If he can look inconspicuous and unremarkable, I feel like Udyr would be happy to do that. He'd be happy not being the center of attention, and so this low-key design aesthetic fits him really well. As for his lore and story, well, like most every League of Legends champion, Riot have put out an absolutely delicious trail of breadcrumbs for him, and like most every League of Legends champion, it's impossible to expect that anything will ever actually come of it. With Riot gutting the staff and budget of Legends of Runeterra, with the comics collaboration with Marvel collapsing a few years back, and with the, at this point, pretty obvious internal confusion about ownership and maintenance of projects like the Universe, yeah, I mean, we can pin our hopes on a Riot Forge game or the MMO, and maybe they'll let Anthony Reynolds write more novels, but the odds of any one champion seeing satisfying resolution or movement in their story arcs are as slim as they have probably ever been, if I'm honest. I don't think Udyr's gonna get an Arcane season. Still, on its own merits, looking at what is there, the Udyr rework is a damn solid character design with some damn good narrative hooks. And maybe that's enough, at least for now. Hey, thank you very much for watching another episode of What's the Deal With? Shoutouts again to Chibin for grabbing the Udyr animations from the game for me, because I wouldn't have been able to do the animation segment without that. So huge shoutouts. Seriously, go subscribe to him. And did you like the way that the animation segment worked out this time around? I kind of liked it. I really do enjoy loading up a character model in a model viewer and just kind of going through their animations and blabbering on about them. But that's also sort of it's very conversational. It's almost more for streaming. I feel like it would be more for streaming animation segments. And in these videos that are otherwise so closely scripted, I've sort of started to feel like the animation segment is always like this slightly overbloated part of the videos. That's it's not that it's bad, it's just that it's really long and it sort of doesn't fit with the rest of the video. So I've been thinking about maybe doing these animation segments as fully scripted things in the future. You can let me know what you think about that then in the comments if you want, but I'll probably make my decision on my own. And speaking of scripting and stuff, if you are curious about how I write the scripts for these videos, I recorded the entire script writing process for What's the Deal with Udyr, from start to finish, unedited, and that's going to be going up on my second channel now, as this video is premiering. It's 10 hours, and for most of it I don't talk because I'm typing, but if you're curious about how I make these videos, that's a look at least at the script writing process of it. It's just something I decided to do for fun, partly to sort of track how long I actually spend writing these scripts, because I've never really done time tracking, and then might as well put it up on the second channel. Maybe you can use it as a podcast to fall asleep to or something. I don't know. Give it a shot. Anyway, the video is sponsored, so I won't plug the monetization stuff, but I have a second channel where I do Let's Plays. That's youtube.com/2bsgein, link in the description. And I have a Twitch channel where I stream sometimes. I keep forgetting to tell people that I have these things, but I probably should do that more, shouldn't I? I'm streaming a lot of Final Fantasy XIV over on Twitch recently, so if you want to come along to watch that, or hop onto my server and chase after me like a bunch of other people like to do, I would be extremely happy to have your company. A little bit of housekeeping. The Many Meanings of Bloodborne. People ask me about this. Yeah, I'm still working on it. It's so far it's 190 pages of submissions. I am almost through editing all of them, and after that there's a bunch more work that needs to get. I want to have it out by the end of the year, but no, yeah, I'm working on it. It's just it's hard. And the same thing goes for Elden Ring. I really do want to do more. God, I am desperate to jump back into Elden Ring, but there is a bunch of other obligations that I have to deal with, and it might be still months before I can get back into it, which is extremely frustrating for me, as I'm sure it is for you guys too. But no, I want to do it. I'm still going to do it. It's just going to take a while. Anyway, I think that's pretty much it. So if you've made it this far, put the lacrosse emoji down in the comments down below, just to see if we can't confuse someone, and I'll put a heart on your comment if you do that. And yeah, thank you very much for watching. Remember to be kind to each other. Have solidarity with those who are worse off than yourself, and may the tides of history wash gently over us all.